I'm Autumn, so I've recently become the staffing member for the Resiliency Subcommittee, and this is the first roundtable I've helped to facilitate, so I really appreciate you all coming. We have a great panel today, and I think we're going to have some really interesting conversation. So on to introducing our panelists. First, we have Jeremy Lougee, who is a project manager and farmland coordinator at SELT. Prior to joining SELT, Jeremy worked for the National Resources Conservation Service in New Hampshire, and he received a master's degree in environmental conservation from UNH, where he wrote a book entitled Sustaining Agriculture in the Granite State, A Citizen's Guide to Restoring Our Local Foods, Farms, and Independence. Jeremy also grew up on a small dairy farm in New Hampton, New Hampshire, and continues to help his family operate the farm, which sells raw milk, yogurt, and a variety of cheeses. And then we have Dr. Allison Leach, who is the SIMAP, which is a carbon and nitrogen tracking program manager at UNH Sustainability Institute. Ali developed the campus nitrogen footprint approach, and she's a co-developer of CMAP. She also researches food systems with a focus on nitrogen pollution and environmental impact food labels. She holds a BS and MS in environmental sciences from the University of Virginia and a PhD in natural resources and environmental studies from UNH. Her dissertation was titled The Nitrogen Challenge, Footprints, Tools, and On-Farm Solutions. And we also have Erin Hale, who has worked with the New Hampshire Food Alliance at the UNH Sustainability Institute for a number of years. And she also teaches in the Sustainability Dual Major program at UNH. And she is a resident of Durham. So those are our speakers, and I can hand it over to Jeremy to start us off.
Thanks, Autumn. I'm going to try to share my screen here. Hopefully that works. Can everyone see it now? Yeah. Okay, great. Just gotta get myself on board. All right, well, yeah, so I thought I'd just talk a little bit about.
Jeremy, I think you might be on your wrong screen. Yep.
Oh, okay, here, hold on one second. Did I do that?
Yes.
Right. Are we good now?
Good. Yes.
Okay, great. I'm just gonna shift over a little bit. The multiple screen thing kind of has me thrown off. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that SELT has done on farmland conservation work in our area. We cover a service area of Rockingham and Stratford counties. We do about equal amount of projects in each county. You know, fortunately for Stratford County, there are more larger parcels still within that county. So we tend to do a little bit more acreage in Stratford County. But what I'd like to talk about, you know, is why we're in the farmland protection business and sort of what kind of impact that makes. So, you know, just to point out, we've already lost a tremendous amount of farmland, now more than 90% since 1925. A lot of that was lost due to just not being used and growing back into forests. But, you know, as everyone knows who has grown up on the seacoast or in either Stratford or Rockingham counties, you know, we've lost a tremendous amount to development as well. And I always like to start off any kind of presentation like this to just say, you know, contrary to some popular belief, SELT is not at all opposed to development. You know, in fact, we're for it. We're just about developing in a smart fashion and figuring out where the appropriate place is for homes and you know, where there are certain pieces of the land that, you know, just in terms of quality of life and long-term food security, we're going to want to protect the existing farmland and, you know, wildlife habitat and other resources that make our counties such a wonderful place to live. So SELT's mission is to protect and sustain the lands in our community for clean water, outdoor recreation, fresh food, wildlife, and healthy forests. And you know what that means when we're protecting farmland. You know, we're not just protecting the ability for us to produce food in the future, but also, you know, protect the existing rural character that we have that still exists here in southern New Hampshire, important wildlife habitat, water supply, that's public water supply, and I think we're going to hear a little bit more from Allie about how farms can have an impact on water supply, but if done in a smart way, they tend to be a lot better than the hundreds of houses that may cover those farms and the lawns and everything else that would contribute to. So, how this all connects together with the food system. Our food here in New England travels an average of 1,500 miles to get to us. As we saw briefly during the pandemic, we only really have about a 5-day supply of food in our grocery stores, and you never know what might disrupt that food chain. But if anything is disrupted for more than 5 days, New England, generally speaking, is going to be out of food, except for the little bit of food that we're currently producing right now. And that's somewhere in the neighborhood of 10% when you average it across all of New England. I think a lot of folks for a long time, in fact, long before, I was in this business, have been thinking about that and thinking about how we can get to be producing more of the food that we consume here in New England. There's a New England food vision, which Aaron may speak to later. But the goal is to be producing around 50% of the food we consume by 2060. So it's a lofty goal, but there are a lot of people working towards that goal right now. And, the way we think about it at SELT is, we can't ever get to that goal if we don't protect the rest of the important farmland that we still have that remains unprotected. So American Farmland Trust has done a lot of work in this area. They've kept track of the farmland loss and, sort of what that means to, the agricultural ecosystem. So since 2001, we've lost nearly 12,000 acres. Prime farmland is most at risk because it's level ground with very little stones, typically already cleared in field conditions. So it couldn't get much easier for a developer to purchase that property and just plop a bunch of houses in. That farmland, in addition to being lost, for food production, there's also there is a hit to the economy. That amount of farmland that we've lost since 2001 would be producing a little over $5 million a year in agricultural products. Another thing that's really important to think about is as we see a transition from some of the older farmers to younger farmers, that transition is happening right now. In fact, there's 5 times more producers over the age of 65 than under 35. So we know that in the next 10, 20 years, a lot of the existing farmland that's not protected is going to be transferring hands. And so if we can't get in there and protect it or help facilitate some of those transfers, we know that land would more than likely become developed. So this is just a study that was done in Londonderry. A lot of times we hear the argument that, putting a bunch of houses in an existing agricultural field is going to generate more taxable income for a community. In Londonderry, they did an actual study on a housing development that was going to put about 290 houses in on a farm. And what they determined after the study is that after taxes, after the town received taxes from all 290 of those houses, the town services that would be used to service those houses would cost the town about $642,000, as opposed to a very small net increase in taxes from that farm. So if you think about it, there's a lot of profit to be made there, but it's generally made by the developer. So we have a lot of groups working in our corner. Farmland protection isn't cheap, especially down here on the seacoast. So we work alongside groups that some of you may be familiar with, like Land for Good, conservation commissions, agricultural commissions in towns. I wish there were more agricultural commissions, but there are a few good ones in the area. Department of Agriculture, Markets and Foods is a big supporter, and they help where they can, as is Farm Bureau. At SELT, we find funds at sort of all levels and nooks and crannies. At the federal level, we use NRCS Agricultural Land Easement Program. We use LCHIP quite a bit, and we partner with local communities to use their conservation funds. Sometimes do a vote at town meeting if the farm is important enough, but we sort of look everywhere we can, and oftentimes, particularly with the farmland projects, we see in order to put that budget together, we get funds from anywhere from 7 to 10 different funding sources per project. So it can be complicated and a challenge, but it's certainly rewarding when you see it happen. So some of you may know Scruton's Dairy. It's been around for a very long time. We worked with the family, Jason and Carrie Scruton, to protect that property in 2020. You can see Baxter Lake there in the background. You know, a lot of reasons why this farm is important, not just to the community, but the region. They've been there. This is the 5th generation on the farm. That's Jacob Scruton there feeding calves. He is the 5th generation. And it's only one of 4 commercial dairy farms left in all of Stratford County when there used to be literally hundreds. So, you know, right now we're getting milk from farther and farther away. And, you know, but milk is not a commodity that can be shipped across the country. So at some point, you know, if we lose these dairy farms and they get split up, we simply won't be able to have, you know, fresh milk on our counters. It's also, the farm is really important from a wildlife perspective. The top 3 tiers of the Wildlife Action Plan were all represented on this farm, and a portion of this farm is also supporting the Barrys Brook watershed, which is water that the city of Rochester uses for its community. Scrutons were just model farmers. They work very closely with NRCS, both on energy efficiency projects, but also on nutrient management, particularly as I showed you, because Baxter Lake is so close to the farm. So they've done a lot of work to try to manage their nitrogen and their other outputs, and they've done really well with that. So one thing that I try to do when I'm protecting farms is try to engage the local community. This is a picture actually at Bodwell Dairy Farm in Kensington. We had a group of Portsmouth elementary school kids come, and you know, you wouldn't think this growing up in New Hampshire, but a lot of these kids said they had never seen a cow in person before. So seems shocking, but they just, I mean, they hopped out of the bus, and this is a picture, you know, after they literally sprinted over to this field to get a close look at the cows. They were just amazed. So I think it's really important to make sure the community is aware that we're protecting these farms and why we're doing it, and you know, why it's important to have a secure local food system. Some of the last things that I'll touch on, we're doing a lot of work with younger farmers who are currently leasing land. It's not a particularly secure way to operate a business, but it's in a lot of cases they don't really have any other options because farmland in New England is so expensive to purchase, and on the seacoast it's even more so. So we're seeing these young farmers that are developing businesses on leased land, and you know, they're at a point now where if they don't make a purchase soon, it feels like some of them may not continue farming. So we've been able to make a few connections. This is Jimmy and Kristen up at Clyde Farm. They had leased land for about 5 years down in the Brentwood, Exeter area. And we were able to make a connection with the Carlson family in Farmington. This property used to be a dairy farm, and the Carlsons had retired from that business, and the farm had sat fairly idle for about 10 years. And the matriarch decided she wanted to see the farm protected before she moved in with her daughter. So we happened to be talking with them about conservation and made this connection, and Jimmy and Kristen were able to purchase the property at the same time that we conserved it. So they were able to buy it at a more affordable rate. And, in any circumstance like that we can help make that connection, we do everything in our power to do that. So last, just some of the things that we're thinking about on the horizon. We are trying to deal with this affordability issue. When farmers can't afford to purchase land and actually make a profit from their farm business, something is wrong or something is out of whack. And the amount of effort that we and the communities do to protect these farms, it's important to see the land protected, but ultimately, if it's not being farmed, it's not really serving the purpose that we were hoping it would when we protected it in the first place. So we're beginning to use something called an option to purchase at agricultural value, where essentially the land trust holds on to an option to purchase the farm anytime it's sold. And so what we do is we ensure that the landowner is selling to another farmer who intends to keep it productive and in food production. If that's not the case, then we have the right to step in, purchase it, and redirect it to a farmer who intends to farm it. So it's a lot more complicated than that, but in a nutshell, that's essentially what that option to purchase does. So that's all I have. I'm not sure if we're gonna do questions now or hand it off and hold questions till later.
Thank you for that, Jeremy. Yeah, so typically we do the Q&A at the end of the session. I forgot to mention before, folks, if questions come up as these presentations are going on, feel free to put them in the chat or send them to me, and I'll make sure that they're answered at the end. So I can hand it over to Allie now.
Great, thanks so much, Autumn. And thanks, Autumn and Jackson and everyone at Dover for organizing this session. I'm really happy to be here, to be talking about food production. I don't live in Dover now, but lived there for several years, and it's just such a special community. So really happy to be a part of this today. So can you all see just the slide? Okay, great. Also dealing with 2 screens here and Monday morning and all that. So great. Well, thanks everyone. So I'm going to be giving us a kind of the 30,000 view here of food production. So in my work, I look at global and US-wide impacts of food production. And we'll talk at the end about some possible solutions, and from Jeremy's presentation on land use and some of the great strategies that they're using to try to protect our farms, and with what Aaron's going to talk about in terms of some programs in New England. We'll have more of that New England focus, but right now I'm going to be talking more broadly about the environmental impacts of food production, and wanted to start with just some context here that this, of course, it seems obvious, but I think it's still really important to be stated that food is central to our lives, to our health, to our culture, and to our quality of life. We need food both to survive and also for many, many other reasons. We have a growing global population, and our growing global population needs more food. And not only are we needing more food, but we're seeing that as countries are developing, there's also a preference for more meat. So countries are beginning to consume more and more meat. And you can see this top graph here has global meat consumption, and the bottom graph here shows meat consumption by country. And you'll see later on that meat production in particular is more resource intensive. So we're facing a situation where we have more people that need more food, and also a demand for more resource intensive types of food. And that modern agriculture has given us many benefits, but that there are, of course, trade-offs. So the benefits, we're able to produce more food than ever before with new agricultural technologies that are more resource efficient. We have better ways of applying fertilizer, better diets for our animals, and better ways of managing wastes from farms. And also that some of these modern agricultural practices and conventional agricultural practices like intensification save land, trade-offs there, of course, but that intensification needs less land to produce food. But of course, there are many challenges associated with our modern agricultural system. A major challenge is producing more food, fiber, and biofuel, and producing that food while also alleviating rural poverty, improving diets and health, increasing environmental resources for future generations, and trying to do all of this in the face of climate change. As our world is changing and climate change impacts all aspects of food production. So what we're going to take a look at now is some of the broad ways that food production and agriculture can impact the environment. I'll end with a few strategies, a few potential solutions, but first want to set the stage here in terms of how broadly food production can impact the environment, so we can use that information to talk about solutions. So the 5 here that I'm going to highlight are greenhouse gas emissions, nutrient pollution, biodiversity loss, freshwater consumption, and land use. There are more, but we're going to focus on these here right now. So first one we're going to take a look at is greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. And greenhouse gas emissions like carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, of course, contribute to the warming effect and to climate change. So how do agricultural emissions, or how do agricultural practices release these greenhouse gas emissions? So a common one that you all have probably heard of is the technical term is enteric fermentation, but that's essentially cow burps that release methane. And methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. So it's actually 28 times as impactful when compared to carbon dioxide. So releasing a small amount of that can have a bigger impact than releasing an equivalent amount of CO2. Manure management is also a big one, and the way that we manage our manure can have a really big impact on the amount of nitrous oxide, also a potent greenhouse gas, and methane emissions coming from our manure management. And soil respiration is another one. So our soils also can release CO2. Our plants, as they grow, can take up CO2 as well. So that's why we've got these up and down arrows here, but the way that we manage our soil, manage our land, can have an impact on what that flux looks like. So for example, no-till agriculture can help reduce that. And then if we're looking on a global scale, that deforestation is a really big source of greenhouse gas emissions, especially when we're looking at regions like the Amazon and the rainforest there. It's becoming increasingly common that land is being cleared there, these old growth forests, for agricultural production. And that has really 2 types of impacts. One is that when those trees are cut down, that's releasing that CO2, that carbon that was stored in those trees, releasing it into the atmosphere. And in addition, those trees are then no longer able to take up new carbon. So reducing some of our resilience to the warming effect there, really a negative feedback loop. And there's been lots of work done on this topic. There was a special report from the IPCC that came out just a couple of years ago that, if you're interested, a great resource for more information. And just for context here, also wanted to mention that in the US specifically, agriculture is responsible for agriculture is responsible for over 10% of greenhouse gas emissions in the US. But if we look globally, when we account for that effect from deforestation, it's actually more than 20%. Then next up is nutrient pollution. So this is another interesting one where there's a trade-off here for nitrogen and phosphorus. If any of you have a garden in your backyard, you probably know that you need to apply some nitrogen and phosphorus to grow your crops. If you get a bag of fertilizer, it'll often have the NPK ratio on it, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. And so we need those nutrients to grow our crops. And the sources of those nutrients are also a very interesting story as well, with some impact. So phosphorus is available in a limited supply. We get most of it from mining in just a few countries. And so there's some geopolitical aspects to our phosphorus stores as well. There are some new strategies, old strategies really, about recycling manure, and new strategies around processing wastewater that might help us recycle and recover some of that phosphorus. But globally, we do have a limited supply of it from these natural reserves. Nitrogen is a very different story in terms of its source. We actually have essentially an unlimited supply of the kind of nitrogen that we need for fertilizer. And that's because of an industrial process called the Haber-Bosch process. And this process was developed a little over 100 years ago by two German scientists, Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch, where they essentially figured out a way to take unreactive nitrogen, N2, from the atmosphere and fix it into a form that we can use for fertilizer, ammonia. Their motivation was actually not, although we use it broadly for fertilizer production today, synthetic fertilizer production, the process was actually originally developed for a very different use of ammonia, and that's for munitions. So it was developed in Germany in the lead up to World War I, but is now widely used for fertilizer production. And we actually make so much of this synthetic fertilizer, so much of this ammonia, that humans are now responsible for releasing 2 to 3 times as much nitrogen into the environment as the natural cycle does. So we've really altered this global nutrient cycle with fertilizer inputs. So that's the sources that we need these nutrients to grow our crops. But not all these nutrients get into our crops. So much of it stays in the environment where it can contribute to environmental effects. Here I've got an algal bloom. So phosphorus and nitrogen are the main source of algal blooms and dead zones in bodies of water. Nitrogen also can contribute to local air quality problems as well, to a cascade of impacts. So our nutrient use, how we use those nutrients and using them efficiently, is really key. Biodiversity loss is another potential impact from agriculture, and how we manage our farms has really significant impacts on biodiversity. Another aspect where there is really a trade-off here, where we need agricultural biodiversity for a resilient food system, but some agricultural practices can also cause biodiversity loss. So we need agricultural biodiversity to help ensure that we can continue to produce food, fiber, and fuel. This biodiversity gives us some protection because this biodiversity means essentially a variety of plants and animals, and also genetic diversity as well within those strains of types of plants and animals. And it gives us some resilience and some protection to things like pests and diseases. So if we're relying on just a couple of types of apples, for example, and then we have a particular pest that can wipe those out, then we don't have any more apples, right? So if we have a big variety of apples, then there's more protection to particular pests and diseases. So it allows us to adapt to changing conditions. And then on the flip side, agricultural can also cause biodiversity loss. I've got a couple of examples here of how it can contribute to that. One aspect is habitat loss, where habitat loss can contribute to loss of species eventually. Overexploitation of resources, so overfishing here as an example, where globally we've overfished over 30% of our fishing resources, and almost 60% of global fish stocks are fished to capacity. And so, of course, seafood is a really important part of food production in New England, an important one to consider here as well. And pesticide use and habitat loss and diseases have all led to a decline in our pollinators. And we also rely on our pollinators for our food production system. Many of our crops, our fruits, need pollinators to grow and to produce. An aspect that we don't think about as much in New England, but that is really important in other parts of the world, is water scarcity. I lived in Colorado for a few years, and water was a very limited resource there, fresh water. And so water rights and water access were really essential to farms. And so here you can see that parts of the Western US are already experiencing physical water scarcity. And of course, with climate change and increasing droughts, that's only become a growing problem. And that agriculture uses a big portion of our freshwater supply. So between arable land and livestock, about 70% of our global freshwater supply is used by agriculture. And Jeremy spoke a bit about land use, so I won't say very much about this here, just that this diagram is showing our total global land use, how much of that is habitable, and then focuses into how we're using that land for agriculture, that we use a lot of our land for agriculture, and we want to make sure that land is being used carefully and thoughtfully, using practices that are going to help preserve our biodiversity, help protect our environment, while also meeting our needs for growing food. So I wanted to close with just a few potential solutions here, answering this question of how do we meet our food needs while minimizing these environmental consequences? How do we develop a more resilient food system? And there are many strategies, just highlighting a few here. On the farm itself, improving resource use efficiency is really a big one, and there's lots of ways to do this. And what do I mean by that? I mean the resources that we put into our farms, like fresh water, like nitrogen, phosphorus, using those as efficiently as possible so that we're minimizing the losses of those really crucial resources to the environment. Improving resource use efficiency also has to do with what we do with our waste streams. So for example, composting, manure and other agricultural byproducts so that we can recycle and reuse those products in our systems. I'm incorporating new technologies. There's lots of really fantastic research happening at UNH and at many other universities, looking at ways that we can help reduce the environmental impact of our farms. So for example, looking at different diets for cattle to actually reduce those methane emissions, looking at different types of forage. There's lots of really fantastic strategies there. Siting our farms carefully and thoughtfully. And this is a broader, bigger picture one, more about general land use, but thinking about maybe not planting very water intensive crops in areas that don't get a lot of rainwater. So that type of broad planning, siting farms and crops on the types of land that make sense for their needs. And then at the broadest level, developing a diverse food system. So if we're relying on just those big monoculture farms, which I think in many ways we will need to have to some extent to produce enough food for a growing population, but we also need those regional farms, those local farms. We saw, as Jeremy mentioned, with food supply chain disruptions during the pandemic, that our food supply is vulnerable, really, that and there will likely be interruptions in the future. So everything we can do to ensure that we have lots of ways to access food from across the US, but also within our region is going to improve our resilience going forward. And as consumers, as individuals, there's also things that we can do as well to help improve the resilience of our food system. And one of those is supporting those local farms. So making sure that those local farms can grow and thrive. Shifting towards more plant-based diets. We know that the meat production system is often more resource intensive. So finding a more balanced diet that uses less resources and ensures that we can use our land in a less impactful way. Reducing food waste, making sure that we're buying what we need, using our food carefully. Composting the food waste that we still produce to try to recycle some of those nutrients. And then to support our pollinators in our yards, we can plant native blooming plants to try to give pollinators a wider habitat. So with that, I'm going to wrap up and going to look forward to more discussion later on. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Allie. That was great. Really great overview. And I like the farm and consumer strategies that we can all take away from that. I think that's a good transition into what Erin's going to talk about and the strategies that are going on with the New England Feeding New England project. So go ahead.
Great. Can you guys see my slides? Okay, perfect. Yeah, and thanks a lot, Allie. I want to invite you to come talk to my intro sustainability class at UNH because that was such a great overview. So I just want to talk really briefly about some of the ways that a couple of initiatives going on right now to address some of these problems that both Jeremy and Ali have touched on. And the one I want to highlight today is the New England Feeding New England project, which is a project of the New England State Food System Planners Partnership, which is essentially a community of practice of a number of statewide food system networks that are working to support resilient, sustainable food system planning across New England. So here in New Hampshire, we have the New Hampshire Food Alliance. We've been in existence since about 2013. Trying to bring together folks, everybody from Farm Bureau and NOFA and Extension to the food bank and kind of everybody in between that's working to create a stronger, more robust and viable food system here in New Hampshire. And you see these other state networks as well, are doing similar things across New England. And we also work really closely with Food Solutions New England, which is another initiative out of the UNH Sustainability Institute. And I think Jeremy mentioned that they have the New England Food Vision, with this vision of getting to 50%, producing 50% of the food that we consume here in New England. And the New England Feeding New England project, we work really closely with Food Solutions New England. And in a way, I kind of think about it as sort of the Food Solution New England is providing the vision of sort of where do we want to get to? What does this future look like? And the New England Feeding New England project is trying to help create a roadmap. How do we get there? So this project is actually looking at sort of a shorter term goal of 30 by 30. So how do we get to producing 30% of the food that we consume in New England by 2030? And, there's a lot of different ways to address this, but really, thinking about all of the different ways that we are trying to support farms, protect farmland, create shorter supply chains. And so I'll talk a little bit about sort of how this project intends to do that. So again, just reiterating, I think what Jeremy and Ali have already said, sort of why is it important to be thinking about building a more robust regional food system? It's really, thinking about food security as we are facing a lot of uncertainty in the future, possible disruptions that we saw during climate change, during COVID, and looking into the future, thinking about how climate change is definitely going to be disrupting our global and national food supply chains. This project is also really trying to address some of the current inequities and disparities that we see in our food system that exists right now, particularly among marginalized communities. So when we try to envision what a future food system will look like, it's not just sort of producing more food, but it's trying to make sure that everybody has access to sustainably produced, healthy and nutritious food. So just briefly, the project timeline, this is sort of a 10-year project. We have funding from the USDA and from other private foundations. Right now, our funding is just for a couple of years, and the focus is really on research. So trying to understand where are we at right now, how much food are we producing, what are the assets in terms of infrastructure that we have right now, where are the kind of gaps in production, what are the opportunities, how much economically are we, is our local food system contributing to the economies of our state and region. The planning phase will be next, where we're going to be engaging with leaders like you. And I think planners are a really key part of trying to implement ideas and solutions to get to 30 by 30. So I'm really thrilled that you all are thinking and talking about food systems right now. And then finally thinking about, implementation from 2023 and beyond. The project areas of focus, I've already mentioned the research sort of into production, consumer demand. How are these markets going to be changing as our populations change, and what kinds of foods might we need to be producing more of, and can we produce more of here in New England? Communications and engagement. And then the other piece, which I just want to talk about really briefly today, is the resilience assessment. So we are creating a food systems resilience assessment tool that will be designed to be used by community and regional planners, food councils, cities, community groups, anybody who's interested in thinking about how can we start planning for a more resilient and sustainable food system. And we are working in partnership actually with Vermont Law School and the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems to create this resilience assessment tool. A couple of researchers in 2019 published a research report all about food systems resilience, trying to understand what's the latest research, how are we defining that, how do we assess resilience, and they came up with a great report. But we contacted them and said, would you like to work with us to try to turn this into a tool that planners and cities and other community groups might be able to use to actually assess how resilient is their food system, and what are the policy changes that they might be able to institute to actually create more resilience in their local food system. So the tool will have sort of introductory guidance, how to use it, how might you organize a team, and then there's different modules that can be used separately or independently. And part of what we are recognizing is that a lot of this planning is already happening, at the regional planning level, the city planning level, and so we're hoping that planners like you would be able to take parts of this module and kind of fit it in with existing planning processes that you're already doing. So within each module, there's an assessment and rating system to kind of see how are we doing, and then suggested policy strategies with examples. So this is a really quick and dirty overview of that. I'm happy to take more questions, but I also really encourage any of you who are interested in learning more to sign up for the NEFNI, the New England Feeding New England emails. We have quarterly updates that everybody is invited to. So you'll get to be on it's a Zoom call, but there are folks from across New England. We actually have our summer quarterly meeting tomorrow from 3 to 4:30. And Emily Spiegel from Vermont Law School will actually be presenting about the resilience assessment in more detail. And I have the Zoom link there, and I can also put it in the chat, which might be a little easier for you to access after I'm done here. And then the other piece is that we are working really closely with other planners, and we're actually, Emily and Jenny Lee are working really closely with the North Country Food Council and the planning commissions up in the North Country to draft this tool. So they're in the midst of trying to do an assessment, and so they're working sort of helping to develop as they go, helping to develop the tool and kind of test things out. And we've got a couple of other communities that are interested in kind of helping to kind of pilot the assessment as it's being developed. And so we've been having focus groups with planners and other interested people. We have one coming up on the 28th. So if you're interested in kind of being more involved in the development and kind of thinking about the tool on a deeper level, I really welcome you to get involved that way as well. And again, I'll put the registration for that there too. And even if you can't come, I guess I would encourage you to register if you're just interested in learning more, because you'll get further information about other workshops and presentations forthcoming. Just a couple of other ways that you might be able to participate or get involved. So at the end of this research phase, which is finishing up in the summer and fall, there will be opportunities to present that research, to share that research. So again, if you get on that list, you'll be the first to know about sort of all this incredible data that's coming out from the 14 different researchers that are working on the project right now. I'd also encourage you to engage with the New Hampshire Food Alliance. We have a lot of different working groups and, you know, a monthly newsletter to hear about all the exciting work that folks are doing to help build the strong local food economy here in New Hampshire. And really briefly, and I can share this, Autumn, I can share actually document, our climate action team recently put together a document, which is longer than this, about 6 ways to build a climate resilient food system here in New Hampshire. And you've heard all of these things, both from Jeremy and from Allie, right? But we are, you know, working on building this out so that you can understand who are the groups here in New Hampshire who are already working on doing these things. What kinds of things might we learn from other communities or organizations that are already taking initiative, and what might we want to contribute or participate in our local community. So again, happy to share more about any of those resources, and I'll put those links to in the chat as well.
Thank you, Erin, for sharing all of that. And I just want to let everyone know I will do the work of consolidating all of the information and resources shared by our panelists to send out to you all, so you don't miss anything. But if you could put those links in the chat, that would be great. So we do have some questions that have already been lined up in our chat. The first we've got from Steve. I don't know if you want to address your question, Steve, about the Farm Bill first, and we can move on to others from there.
Yes, thanks. So public policy is what I'd like to bring up a little bit more, other than consumer and farm, what farms can do on their own. It seemed to me, was from some of the reading I was doing this morning, that decades of the Farm Bill passing in various administrations have largely subsidized the largest farms that don't necessarily need the help, and in context of free trade measures, also created a lot of economic refugees from Central America. What does the Farm Bill do, and what should it do?
So I'd like to invite any of our panelists to answer, or anyone else in the group. I definitely don't have the answer.
Well, I can just share one very small aspect of the Farm Bill that I'm obviously plugged into. So nearly all of our agricultural easements are at least partially funded through the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is a part of U.S. Department of Ag. And the Farm Bill is responsible for those funds being allocated. And I wish I could recall off the top of my head what those numbers are, but they're staggering. Something in the neighborhood of $250 million a year is going towards these agricultural land easements. You know, New Hampshire usually brings in somewhere between 2 and 3 million. And we simply wouldn't be able to get our farmland protection work done without that resource. So it doesn't necessarily speak to what Steve was suggesting may need some fixing, but we're always pushing to try to bring more funds, particularly to New England, where the farms are smaller, but the dollar per acre it takes to conserve them is substantially higher than what might be paid out in some of the bigger farms out west. So Farm Bill functions in a good way in that regard, but definitely some things that need to be fixed. So I'll let others answer that.
And I'll just jump in and say that I put a link in the chat to a great resource from the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition that does a lot of advocacy around the Farm Bill. They've got a video and a huge website about what is the Farm Bill, what does it do, how can you get involved? They're a great resource. We actually, at the New Hampshire Food Alliance, at our statewide gathering, which we had in person for the first time in the last couple of years, in May, we had a whole session about the Farm Bill. I didn't go to it. I was at another session. I wish I'd gone so that I could better answer this question. But I do know that, the Farm Bill, the majority of funding for the Farm Bill is actually for food assistance. So for SNAP, food stamps, and for nutrition assistance programs. And one of the things that, here in New England, efforts like Food Solutions New England and the New England Feeding New England project, we're really trying to do a better job of sort of advocating at the federal level for New England as a region. And because as sort of our small little states, we don't necessarily carry a ton of weight down in Washington, but I think as, together as a group, we can sort of move policy forward together. And, and I think that programs, increasing support for programs like Granite State Market Match, are folks aware of that program? So this is supported from the Farm Bill that gives folks who are on food assistance on SNAP, they can double the value of their food dollars with federal funding. And just last year, actually, we got New Hampshire for the first time has put forward some money in the state budget to support that work. And that was a huge victory for us, actually, because we're leaving a lot of money on the table, federal dollars on the table, by not contributing state funds. So that's an example of another sort of area of advocacy whereby supporting programs that help get more local food onto everybody's plates, we can help support our local farms too.
Well, just echoing back what I heard some of you say earlier, there, Jeremy brought up affordability of land. There was some suggestion of there could be some money for resilience, because that is something we value somehow. And the word invest was used. So money at some point matters, and increasing the price of food is necessary, I would say, to make it possible for farms to continue. I mean, 25% of Americans were farmers in 1930, and now it's 1%. And the generation, they're all retiring. It's very challenging. So the way to make it work here is to value it, value having food here in some way. How do we, that's the real question. How do we allocate our resources towards what we need? Sorry, just to finish, one more thought. The goal of 60% of our own food by 2060, I personally am doing that now. My life is possible. It's not impossible. I happen to make good money, so I work a few hours, and I have a homestead, and I produce more than 60% of my food. And so it's complicated, but interesting, and perfectly possible if everyone lived exactly like I do.
Steve, you just mentioned it, and Jeremy, you mentioned it when you were speaking. Farmers are getting older and nobody's coming in. Does anybody know what's happening from a UNH perspective? We have a lot of people signed up for agricultural programs, people graduating with that quote unquote science.
Well, I'll add that the loss of the Thompson School 2-year programs was a huge loss, I think, at a time when obviously we need more people with that expertise and with that incentive to participate. So a lot of those applied animal programs are gone. That was a huge outlet for my 4-H kids. So as the livestock leader for Stratford County for 4-H, a lot of them did go on through those programs, and some of them are in the slides like Jeremy just did. The Scruton family, they're still in my 4-H club, but I think we lost as an entity a huge resource when those programs were removed. I think about that horticultural program, especially during the pandemic, where all the signs, landscapers were really desperate for people, that seasonal work, and that was where a lot of their seasonal labor came from, was through that horticultural program through UNH, and it's all gone.
Fortunately, Sean Jasper graduated from those programs and has never forgiven UNH for not counting the credits towards a UNH degree, even when the Thompson School was in business.
Yeah.
I would comment that goals without teeth don't work. In fact, they're worse. It gives the state an excuse to say they're doing something when they aren't. I'll give you 2 examples. I sponsored the legislation to 65-25. 65% of the New Hampshire workforce would have a post-secondary credential by 2025, and that passed unanimously. And since then, the state has backslid from 49% down to 47%. But they brag about it at the Chamber of Commerce and elsewhere. And I'll give you an example of a goal that does work, and that was the goal to clean up Great Bay. As soon as the EPA got involved and lawsuits were brought in and legal heft was given to it, the bay is getting clean, and towns are actually doing something about it. So I would caution that. The last comment I would have is the best model I've found is the Vernon Family Farm in Newfield. Their model is wonderful. It's much better than the old model. You put up your money as much as you want up front. You buy whatever products they have there. And because when I was in the legislature, we passed the agritourism bill, they have music and they have entertainment. And it's really fun to shop there now because you can get anything you want. And then when you run out of my $300, I put another 300 down as a credit, and I can go there anytime and buy anything they have and not have to wait for certain products. That is an interesting model that seems to be working. And I know that, I don't know, is Sean still Secretary of Agriculture, Teresa, or Commissioner, whatever he is?
Yeah.
He is terrified that with the land being eaten up by non-agricultural sources. And I know when Teresa worked very hard to get us in Durham to change some of our zoning, you'd think, but we ran into opposition, Teresa, as you know. And it's going to take some political heft to make this actually work. If we really want to reach the goals that you've set.
Yeah, I think that's why I kind of logged in today, was to raise that issue that Wayne just brings. And I really appreciate the 30,000 foot from Allie and Aaron and Jeremy bringing it down to this scale. And I do I read all your emails and follow all your blogs. But the real challenge is, as a regional planner for over 30 years, I work for Rockingham Planning, is that local friction and that problem we have with a butter resistance to additional agricultural activity. And so that's the challenge that we faced in Durham, as Wayne just mentioned, to rezoning. So when you think of some of the slides we've seen today, we were trying to rezone a portion of Durham Route 4, where Emery Farm is, and Wagon Hill Farm, where we have prime farmland soil, active agriculture, families vested in agriculture long, many generations. But there was not, the planning board and the council struggled to see the reason why that should happen. And a butter resistance was really the reason for that. And there's a big fear for animal agriculture and living next to animal agriculture. So I don't know what the solutions are, except for it has to be part of the problem. When I picture like Rubik cubes and we're all trying to spin to find that perfect, I could never solve the Rubik cube, but that perfect lineup of things. Sometimes I feel like in some of the information I read or some of the workshops I attend, we lose sight of how land use decisions, especially in New Hampshire, are locally made. And so without the ability for a farmer to expand or to do certain things on protected land, we've got some big challenges there. And Durham has an active ag commission and lots going on. And so I feel like we have, we had the first agricultural resources master plan chapter. We just adopted a couple of years ago an agricultural ordinance, very pro things, yet some of those actions that need to happen in order for us to feed ourselves can't happen or don't happen. So every town is different, I realize. And but we have some work to do in terms of the consumer perspective about how important this land use activity is. It's not unlike the challenge we face with affordable housing in a way, and that there's a perspective that it can happen someplace else, or that I care about it, but I don't want it next to me. So as we say in Durham, you eat, you in. So
In Barrington, that was my first big political victory of blocking such a maneuver. To essentially, it would have required, I forget the exact wording, but you could only have maybe 15 chickens at the most on 2 acres. And so that's like, what, 1,000 times more, less dense than factory farming, or even more than that. It would make it impossible to be cost effective at all. I mean, already I would have to sell goat's milk at over $100 a gallon if I were to sell it.
I wrote the chicken ordinance in Durham. It's a funny because it says the chickens can't get any further in front of my house than the front line that went across the front of my house. So I told the chickens that, and they understood that they couldn't wander past an invisible line. How sick is that? That people bought that and it actually passed in Durham. I think we can have 12, Teresa, now. I haven't counted my flock recently.
It depends on, yeah, it depends on the zone in Durham, but we did make it zone based, and it was definitely a Durham effort. Yeah.
There is a strange political alliance though here that if it ever came together, our best friends on this issue are the Free Staters. They like independence. They like to be independent of government. And now, so all you lefties out there, keep an eye on these folks because they could be helpful. and maybe the right and the left can come together as a political alliance for different reasons. Some to have healthy food, some to have no government regulation, but they'd be free to grow what they want. You'd think in New Hampshire that might happen, but it probably won't, but I'm always hopeful.
I think this is a great discussion going on. Jackson, did you have something to add? I just, in the interest of time, there was a few more questions in the chat, so.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Autumn. And thank you all speakers for your great presentations. I know personally I learned a lot. This is a topic I'm not as familiar with, like a little more on the nitrogen environmental impact side, but not as much in terms of some of the challenges. And it's certainly important to some of the work I do here in Dover in terms of land protection efforts. So Jeremy, hearing about SELT's role in all this was really interesting. So as a community right now, you know, we're understanding the impacts that impervious surface has, for example, on stormwater runoff and what that means in terms of nutrient loading in the bay. And obviously we want to improve the health of the Great Bay. So there's been some good discussions, and a committee worked really hard in producing a report recommending that our city council pursue potentially a stormwater utility, which would be an equitable way or proposed equitable way to fund improvements to infrastructure to deal with stormwater management, because we have about $5 million in deferred projects that we'll need funding sources for. But this would essentially have people paying in as a utility based on the amount of impervious surface or impervious cover that they have on their properties. And I know I've heard some concerns, especially from our local farmers, about what that will mean for them in terms of economic impacts. Obviously, they're struggling now with the cost of things. So we don't want to create additional strain, but we also have to balance funding, ways to deal with the environmental implications of those operations. And we've heard great arguments on both sides. Obviously, we want to support local food production. So I guess I'm wondering, in terms of stormwater runoff, obviously farmers, they have a lot of impervious, but they also have a lot of, usually a lot of land that's available to them. So what are some good ways for managing that? Is there models for offering like good credit systems, or, I'm just looking for some ideas on the amount of infiltration versus runoff and how we could potentially consider those regarding a utility if that were to be rolled out. Sorry, that was long-winded, but something that's obviously sort of at the forefront of what I'm thinking about recently. That wasn't directed, but if any of the panelists want to chime in for any experience they have, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I was wondering, Jackson, if you could just say a little bit more about the plan and how it would work. So it would be like a water treatment plant where stormwater would be collected and treated, or?
No, not necessarily,
Okay.
but it would fund things like, culvert replacements, rain
Okay.
gardens, like other infiltration and management systems throughout the city, or replacement of piping, for example, or other factors. And some of that funding would go into improving likely our treatment capabilities at the wastewater treatment facility as well. So there's
Okay.
multiple factions. It's really just an issue of, we have very old infrastructure here in Dover that needs a lot of money, and we don't have a good way to come up with that now. And we're trying to get ahead of the curve in terms of sort of some of the recommendations from EPA.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. And
Yeah, no
so
problem.
folks would fund it based on the percent of impervious surface they have, and that funding would be used to support projects to manage and treat that stormwater.
Yes.
I think plans to, or finding ways to replace impervious surfaces with pervious surfaces would be a great starting point that farms could implement that if they have lots of paved area, finding ways that they could replace that with the pervious surface so that they're less impacted by that aspect of it, and it would have the dual benefit of more infiltration on their own land and less runoff. But I can see the trade-off that you're mentioning there, that we do need to continue to protect the Great Bay, and so many of these issues do have these really challenging trade-offs.
Yeah, I don't feel like I have much expertise here other than to just say that my observations working with NRCS, for example, that's the Natural Resources Conservation Service. They do a lot of nutrient management on farms, and oftentimes you'll see that some of the impervious surface built on farms was built for environmental purposes to reduce erosion and runoff. And if they've also thought of ways to treat that runoff, as it hits that impervious surface, you may just be thinking about not all impervious surfaces being created equal, that there may be a good reason for that impervious surface at the farm. And also, and I think you said this directly, that if you look at the amount of impervious surface on a farm versus pervious surface, you may find that farms don't have any more of a percentage of the total acreage as impervious versus any residential, lot. While it may look like the Scruton's Dairy, for example, they do have a very large barn complex that you can see has just been added on over time as they had to increase the number of head they were milking. But when you take that as a component of a very large, 165 acre farm, it may be comparable to a residential, half acre lot with a 2,500 square foot house and driveway.
Yeah, thank you both for those insights. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Go ahead, Wayne.
What policies should the SRPC, now having listened to all of this, what activities should we be engaged in, Jen, do you think?
So that's a very great question, Wayne. So in part, it's one, continuing the conversation here and making sure that we're increasing awareness and education at the local level. So that's one of the main roles that we can play here in this conversation. I mean, as you know, we're an advisory entity. So in that role, we can act as a convener, a facilitator, an educator, and a technical assistance provider. So, and that is where the next component comes in, is that when communities are looking to take some steps and some actions, that, for us to ensure that our staff are well informed and well educated in these topics, and then able to provide some technical assistance or network or connect them with the folks that have the most expertise in these areas. So, this is step one, is the conversation here today, and then going from there to see, what we can do and how we can promote more, policies that will sustain agriculture for our communities.
Yeah, I remember, I don't think SRPC got involved in the Durham development of the agricultural policy, in part because it's dicey. I mean, and I know it for good reason. The SRPC doesn't want to be seen as an advocacy for one side or another in a fight. But I think the technical information, like you've heard tonight or today, would be really helpful for towns that are contemplating how to protect their agriculture. It's not just a NIMBY thing. They're all affected by our ability to grow our own food, and somehow educating the public policy makers and the people that elect them of that is important. And I think I guess I'm going back on the SRPC if I get elected, but I think that should be a focus, the education piece, to undergird policy changes that protect agriculture would be a good activity.
Yeah, most definitely. And, and Wayne, in part, that's why we record these sessions too, so that, that the message can go further than just the folks that were able to join us here on Monday morning. So we'll be then sending out the recording and making sure that all of those on our distribution lists are aware that it is here and available.
And part of what you're saying, Jen, and I think Wayne, you're asking is, as commissioners, we are representatives of our communities. And so, there's a not a requirement, it's not the right word, but there's a thought that these kinds of things that we're highlighting, in particular here with the Resilience Committee, is things that should be being discussed inside our communities. And these resources that we have here today are resources, as I understood earlier, whether it's Aaron or Jeremy or Allie, they're available for discussion within communities. And in some cases, I assume, are having those discussions already. So there's an onus not only on SRPC to bring these things forward, but I think there's an onus on we as commissioners to make sure that that linkage is made between our community and what's happening.
So isn't the main role of SRPC, especially one of the biggest ones, to advise local towns on what they should be doing? So personally, I was recently on the Barrington Planning Board, and because of the way our zoning is written, it didn't seem to be possible to object to a housing development if it were built on prime agricultural land. It was not appropriate grounds. So perhaps SRPC could advise towns to adopt zoning that prohibits non-agricultural development of agricultural land.
The challenge, of course, is that I was involved in trying to stop the gravel legislation when they removed the town's ability to mine gravel. We were up against huge lobbyists from out of state, and eventually we were able to make some headway. But the difference between Great Bay and agriculture is fear. People understand that a polluted Great Bay directly impacts them in terms of tourism, and it just doesn't sound good. The compelling case for agriculture is still yet to be made, because people can still go and buy whatever they want, whenever they want, wherever they want, and don't understand the looming threat that we're up against. Plus, I still don't think people understand that eating food that hasn't been processed is a lot better for us. I'm actually 120 years old, and I've been eating healthy for the last 80 years. So no, I'm kidding, but without a compelling political rationale behind it, initiatives like this don't get as much traction. And of course, then you have to have really good advocates for it too, like the governor, but he doesn't talk about it very much, even though he lives in Newfield. So anyway, we've got a lot of work to do on this one for sure.
I think you've all brought up some really great points, and Jeremy, I see you've unmuted yourself. I just wanted to say that the goal of this session and our second part to this session, inviting more farmers and people who are on the ground and need assistance from their communities. The goal is to educate and, invite the municipal leaders and decision makers to the table. Yes, education, and public outreach. That's kind of where we're starting. SRPC is just kind of beginning to join the conversation on food systems and what we can do to advise our municipalities. So yeah, I just want to say we're starting there, and you're here with us, joining our journey. So yeah, we are looking to be a more influential leader in this topic area, I guess, as we go forward. And Jeremy, I'll let you go ahead.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I was just going to agree with Wayne, and I think, we've been having this conversation not at the national or state level, but at the local level, since the mid 70s, during the oil embargo, we've been thinking about the dramatic security issues we have if we aren't able to produce the food that we consume. If you look at it at the national level or the local level, and what we don't have in this country is a real collective appreciation for what it feels like to be hungry. We've just had a food system that has churned out food for such a long time successfully that that fear isn't real to a lot of people, and it is real to some people, and Aaron spoke to that a little bit in terms of food insecurity, but the vast majority of people are just used to going to the grocery store and seeing food on the shelves. So it does speak to having to have more advocacy and trying to share what the concern that we have. And one of the things that we've heard talked about quite a bit in these circles, but it's never really filtered its way down to the local planning board level, is that concern. Prime agricultural soils are very rare in this part of the country, and it's something we actually do a fairly good job of protecting our wetlands, and we understand why those are important, but we don't do a good job of protecting our important farmland soils, and for very much the same reason. And I don't think maybe people in the general public understand this, but you can't just grow food and certainly productively on any kind of soil. It's those prime and statewide important agricultural soils that are going to be growing significant amounts of food. And so, if we choose to continue to ignore that resource that we're losing, it's going to be tough. And I would love to think that everyone has the capability to grow their own food, and definitely applaud Steve for what he's doing. But to feed the populations that we need to think about feeding, we do think about conserving and protecting what little agricultural soils we have left. So that really is, a function of a planning board and thinking about, what type of security do we need to have around those resources before they're gone. Once they're underneath, 100 houses, it's nearly impossible to turn the clock back on that. So, and then one last point, just to sort of say out loud, because this is really kind of a thing that we're beginning to talk about a lot more in the land protection world, and that's renewable energy. Hugely important from a climate change perspective, and we're entirely on board with allowing renewable energy on conservation easements. We're doing a better job of drafting that into the easement deeds to allow that. But what we're seeing across New England is also the very easiest place to locate these renewable energy structures like solar is on farmland, because it's already open. already has great solar exposure. And that's another thing that we really need to be thinking about. Do we want to be putting these large solar arrays on farmland where we also need to be growing food? And that's where I suggest we start looking towards those lower quality soil resources, the more rockier ground, places that we can't otherwise grow food at a significant level, to try to redirect those renewable energy resources that we're going to need. It's just that it probably shouldn't come at the expense of not being able to grow food there.
Having brokered the deal that put the Durham on solar power by putting the arrays on our gravel pit in the town of Lee and negotiating with them, it was a good example of best and highest use for that property. But if I've been commuting to Bangor, Maine the last 8 months, and all along 95, you see fields growing solar arrays now. And you made a very, very good point. Is there an answer to that? How do the two technologies merge? Is there new technologies where you don't need huge fields of solar panels?
Yeah, I'm certainly not an expert in that department, but I know that, folks at the agricultural levels are looking at ways that siting solar panels in a way that is compatible with agricultural beneath them is possible, and they're working on that. But right now, and what you're seeing on the way up to Bangor is very fixed, low-level solar panels that essentially takes the ability to grow food away on those fields. And again, that's not to say that may be a temporary technology that could someday be removed, but much like houses, when you put a solar array on 10 acres of farm field, there is a huge amount of technological value there that it's going to be hard to turn the clock back and just grow food there again. It's producing a financial resource that's greater than what would be produced if it were food. So that's the challenge, I think.
Well, in Maine, which is a much more progressive state than New Hampshire, I was very pleased to work for that governor. The over-the-horizon turbine systems they have would power every house in Maine if they can ever get it up and running. And that looks like they have the technology now to do that. And that would relieve the pressure on local solar array systems that are taking up farmland. So, but it's hard to get it all into balance, isn't it, Jeremy? That's what that's what they pay us for.
Thank you all for the great discussion that we've had so far. Just to be respectful of everyone's time, it is 10:29 and we're supposed to end at 10:30. I know, Jackson, you have your hand up and you have it for a minute or so. I'll let you go in 1 second. I just want to say, first, I'd like to invite everyone to put their name and contact in the chat in case you'd like to connect after this, or if you have any follow-up questions. So I'd like to invite you to do that. I do have a poll to end with, but I'll let Jackson go ahead before I do that. And thank you again to our panelists. It's been a great discussion that we facilitated here, and I look forward to connecting with all of you on the call in the future.
Yeah, and if I can just jump in really quick, there's a lot of great information in the chat, and several of the questions that were posed by chat have been answered by the panelists in the chat. And so I know that Autumn has already mentioned that she will be compiling a lot of materials from this conversation. So all of those great pieces there will be pulled together and sent out to everyone afterwards.
You can go ahead, Jackson.
All right, sorry, I know we're out of time. I'll be really quick. But Jeremy, so I support the Open Lands Committee, and in Dover, they serve as a function to help evaluate and move towards projects of protecting like farmland, for example, or other types of open space for easement purposes. Maybe we can connect more about this offline, but I was just kind of wondering about ways to engage local farmers and sort of make them aware of the process of potentially, conserving their land, because a lot of the challenges that I think we see here is the either the generational gaps or just needing that additional income to retire comfortably by selling off your farm into a housing development. So yeah, considering we're out of time, if you want to follow up with me after, we can have this conversation further, and that would be awesome. But I guess that's something that's important to me and that I'd like to talk about further.
Yeah, I'll answer that very simply by just saying that it's important to convince those folks, if they're at that stage, that they can do just as well as they may selling to a developer as working with the land trust. We pay appraised fair market value for those properties, and we have a long list of examples of folks that have been able to do that. So you can always shoot them our way, or we can certainly talk offline.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jeremy. And I'm just going to launch the poll here now. You should see it on your screen. Just a few questions. Feel free, you don't have to answer them all. But just to give us an idea of where we might like to go forward at our next second part of this roundtable, and then some ideas for different resiliency topics after part 2 of the food systems roundtable. And at the end there, if you'd like to check yes or no to be notified of future events or anything to do with the roundtable or the subcommittee rather.
Adam, I'm sorry, where am I going to see this poll?
It should pop up on your screen.
You have the latest version installed?
That may be the issue if your
Thanks.
Zoom is out of date.
Thanks, Steve.
But you'll be in the loop, Joe, since you're on the subcommittee, so no worries if you can't respond to the poll. And yeah, after the polls come in and after you've finished, you've gathered any contacts you would like to from the chat. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Say, Autumn, could I ask you one quick thing before we sign off?
Sure.
I think this has been fantastic, and clearly it's been recorded, if I understand it, and I know a lot of people that will benefit from it. Where will it be housed, and when will it be put there so that I can pass it on to people?
Jen, I'm not sure where you would like.
Sure, we have a YouTube channel. And Shayna Sylvia in our office takes all of these lovely recordings and does the fine job of doing the necessary clipping, the beginning and the end, and putting a little logo on it and posts them. And she is the most efficient person I have ever met at this. And so it's usually up within a couple days. So we can definitely send you that link when it is available.
So the YouTube link will be on the SRPC site. Is that what you're saying?
It will, but I will put our channel in the chat so you can find it here.
I just want to try and make it as easy as possible. And and I don't know because Dover, but we don't have to go into this now, Jackson, but there's a whole variety of things that make it onto channel 22 that are great. And this is, I think, is an example of one of them that I think, especially the slide decks and the conversation that went along with them. There's a lot of people I think would thoroughly enjoy seeing this. I really believe that. So thank you, everybody. Thank you.
So it's been a great conversation.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.